Here's a question for you. How many National Lampoon movies are there? Just simply movies with titles which have been preceded by the words National Lampoon. 20 maybe? 25 at a push? The answer is at least double that, though the exact number is more complicated than you might think. Depending on the source, it's often counted as over 60 and sometimes 70 or more. 70 films. One way or another, whatever figure you get to, there are a lot of National Lampoon's movies. When you mention the name National Lampoon, people think of the Chevy Chase vacation movies in the 1980s, or the hugely influential Animal House, maybe Ryan Reynolds as Van Wilder, but that is all only scratching the surface of one of the most chaotic tales in film history, as National Lampoon went from a comedy powerhouse to a truly tragic brand for hire. And behind the scenes, things were even more wild. This is a story of incredible highs, unbelievable lows, truly mind-boggling business decisions, FBI raids, court cases, jail time, a smattering of iconic movies, and the many, many terrible ones that followed in their wake. How exactly did National Lampoon go from era-defining, box office smashing classics to one of Hollywood's saddest punchlines? And despite all the chaos, does the brand's movie legacy still somehow hold up today? It's confusing, it's brilliant, it's terrible, it's hilarious, it's sad, and it's all shades in between.
It's a quest. It's a quest for fun.
Thanks, Clark. I love fun and quests.
I'm gonna have fun, and you're gonna have fun.
Is he talking to me or you?
We're all gonna have so much fun we'll need plastic surgery to remove our files.
Okay, Clark, less potty mouth, please. This is a family show.
You'll be whistling zippity-doo-dah out of your
Right, this is getting weird. Roll the tape. This is Sparkle and Fade, the rise and fall of National Lampoon movies. Decades before the likes of Dorm Days 2, Ratko the Dictator's Son, and the legend of Awesomest Maximus, National Lampoon began life as an offshoot of the long-running Harvard Lampoon, a satirical magazine created by the students of Harvard University.
Hey, Egghead! Sing Fair Harvard.
Fair Harvard,
Though the Harvard Lampoon dates back to 1876, the National Lampoon magazine would be launched in 1970 by a group of Harvard graduates, led by editor-in-chief Doug Kenny. They licensed the Lampoon part of the name, took the same philosophy to the mainstream in a national monthly magazine, one which tested the limits of mainstream comedy and satirized American life and culture. The early 70s was a wild time, and the Lampoon magazine's perfectly timed introduction instigated controversy and a whole lot of success. As the magazine grew, with weekly radio shows, touring live shows, and albums all proving successful, by the mid-70s, the Lampoon was becoming a major player. Chevy Chase and John Belushi would be amongst the brand's go-to live performers, with the stardom of both rising exponentially when they joined the cast of Saturday Night Live, which arrived on TV in 1975 and became a cultural phenomenon, something many in the Lampoon world, who privately called SNL a Lampoon ripoff, would come to resent. Either way, the genie was out of the bottle with the launch of Saturday Night Live, and, even though it was still popular, the peak of National Lampoon magazine had been and gone by the latter part of the 1970s. Doug Kenny and his fellow founders had cashed out their equity and sold the magazine ownership to their publisher Matty Simmons, splitting $7 million, a serious amount of cash at the time. Kenny stayed on the writing staff for a couple of years, by which point Hollywood was calling for one of the most influential creative talents of the decade, and the Lampoon's new owner realised just how important keeping Kenny on board was. So, after Saturday Night Live had stolen their thunder on television, Simmons made it clear to Kenny that there was an opportunity for the National Lampoon to move into the movie business instead. So Kenny joined up with Harold Ramis and later Chris Miller to work on the script for the brand's very first film. Wait, cut the music. Even if Animal House would hit the heights in due course, that music's probably a bit too upbeat for what was seen as the Lampoon's realistic chances in Hollywood when they first tried to get a movie made. I mean, Simmons was rejected by almost every studio in town initially. Can we try something a bit more suitable for the story at this stage? There we go. Still groovy, but much more appropriate. Anyway, in the summer of 1978, considerable change was sweeping through the movie business. Grease and Jaws 2 had both arrived in cinemas, and their massive box office numbers were further proof that the age of the blockbuster had officially arrived. Saturday Night Fever, which had been released the previous year, had provided the #1 album for basically the entire first 6 months of 1978. The Grease soundtrack would take its place at the top of the album charts as well before July was over, demonstrating that synergy and multiple revenue streams were the way forward for Hollywood. Speaking of Saturday nights, Saturday Night Live had added Bill Murray to its cast and, though more wholesome comedies still ruled in the ratings, it would have a much longer lasting impact than the likes of Laverne and Shirley and Three's Company. The same could be said for what would end up being the cinematic year's sleeper mega hit, a film made for just $3 million about a fraternity of misfits at Faber College, which would end up grossing 50 times that amount in cinemas alone. And a film which would absolutely revolutionise big screen comedy, even if barely anyone gave it the slightest hope of doing that at the time. None of the 3 writers of Animal House had ever written a film script before, and their pitch was rejected by every studio that the Lampoon shared it with. Only the foresight of a young exec and assistant at Universal, who pushed for the film to get made, allowed it to go into production. As Chris Miller remembers, nobody else got it, but those guys did. Their persistence would pay off handsomely. Filming for Animal House took place in late 1977. Producer Ivan Reitman initially wanted to direct, but he'd only made one cheap Canadian exploitation film called Cannibal Girls, so the chair instead went to John Landis, who had a bit more experience and had just released the Kentucky Fried Movie.
It will knock your socks off.
With novice screenwriters and Simmons as producer though, it was still, to some extent, the blind leading the blind. Landis realised early that the script needed to work as a film narrative. When I was given the script, it was the funniest thing I'd ever read up to that time, but it was really offensive. There can't just be bad guys. Being a Lampoon outsider, he helped to steer the film just the right side of the line that the magazine was regularly leaping over. Set in the early 60s, Animal House told the story of a wild time at Faber College, where John Vernon's dean, with the help of the stuck-up Omega House, attempts to revoke the charter of the raucous Delta fraternity. With nothing to lose, the misfits of Delta fight back, attempting to secure its future whilst partying along the way. It sounds like the most cliched teen college comedy ever, but that's because so many of those cliches were created here.
I've expelled those rowdy members of Chug-a-Lug House.
Oh, I hate that lousy dean.
It's not surprising to say that some of it has aged badly, but Animal House is undoubtedly iconic and groundbreaking. John Belushi's performance as Bluto created one of the most recognisable comedy characters ever. Some going considering this was his first ever film role, and mixing Belushi's unique humour with a selection of more serious actors created something truly different. It's difficult to comprehend how impactful its release was at the time. Reviews for the film were quite positive too, with Newsweek calling it low humour of a high order and Time magazine summing up that the hilarious highs easily compensate for the puerile lows. Somehow, the Lampoon looked like it might have created a hit movie. And when Animal House first hit cinemas in July of 1978, it not only exceeded all financial expectations, but chugged them down, burst them out, and set them on fire. The movie made an insane amount of money. Its initial cinema run grossed over $120 million on its meager $3 million budget and became the 7th highest grossing movie of the entire 1970s in North America, making more money in the US and Canada than the likes of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Kramer vs. Kramer, and Saturday Night Fever. So popular that Studio Universal re-released it just a year later. The film would eventually surpass $140 million from cinema takings alone. The box office takings were a surprise to many, not least star Donald Sutherland, who turned down millions of dollars by taking a flat fee rather than a percentage of the profits from the movie. This was the most money a comedy had ever drawn at the time, only replaced at the top of that tree 6 years later when Ghostbusters, a movie with more than a passing link to Animal House, arrived on the scene. It missed out on what would have no doubt been huge video sales in the immediate years that followed, given it was released a few years too early to ride the wave of the VHS boom of the 1980s. But Animal House was still an immense success. In hindsight, this success was always on the cards. Saturday Night Live and the Lampoon magazine had helped to radically change comedy, and it was inevitable that this new era would blow up at the cinema at some point as well. Animal House tapped into a moment and lit that fuse. It is still one of the most referenced films ever made. Through a mixture of messy management and tragic circumstances, National Lampoon wasn't able to instantly cement its newfound place in Hollywood. The talent that delivered the first movie dissipated across the industry. Kenny and Ramis would write Caddyshack, which the latter also directed, and I've made a video about. And Landis would go on to make The Blues Brothers in 1980, a film which also starred John Belushi, whose fame had been propelled to a new level in the wake of Animal House. Meanwhile, a wave of imitators had followed the Lampoon debut film's success and flooded the market with counterfeit college and high school chaos films. Slobs vs. Snobs movies were everywhere for years to come. Some made money, a few made a lot, but the sea of Slobs vs. Snobs party movies would make it difficult for the fairly rudderless Lampoon to stand out without a strong follow-up. On TV, a direct Animal House spin-off called Delta House turned up on ABC less than a year after the film's release, but only lasted one season, maintaining some of the cast from the movie, but importantly without Belushi. It is probably best known now for introducing the world to Michelle Pfeiffer. In the end though, tragedy became the prevailing narrative of the early 1980s for National Lampoon. Doug Kenny and John Belushi had both passed away before another Lampoon film would make it to cinemas, both at the age of 33, and both just as their film careers were really starting to take off. Kenny's vision had been the driving force behind the Lampoon magazine, and his ambition had made Animal House a reality in the first place. Belushi's untimely passing ended any hopes of an Animal House sequel ever happening. When the brand finally did follow up its huge hit on the big screen, it was clear that things wouldn't be running completely smoothly. National Lampoon's Movie Madness and National Lampoon's Class Reunion both arrived in 1982 and both sank without much of a trace. Class Reunion in particular was supposed to be the company's next smash hit, but massively underperformed, making just $10 million for 20th Century Fox. The main creative link Class Reunion actually had to the Lampoon staff was its young writer John Hughes. Yes, that John Hughes. Although Hughes would later state that his script had been completely butchered and that he was shocked when he saw the quality of the final movie. All was not lost, however, for either young writer Hughes or the National Lampoon's Hollywood prospects. Work was underway on their next project, the real Animal House follow-up, starring a familiar Lampoon face who would be returning to the fold as a movie star on the cusp of blowing up. Because yes, 1983 saw the release of National Lampoon's Vacation. Now we are talking. Produced by Lampoon publisher Matty Simmons and based on a short story from the magazine written by John Hughes, Vacation would not only be directed by Harold Ramis, fresh off both Caddyshack and the Bill Murray starring Stripes, but would star Chevy Chase. Ramis and Chase would work with Hughes to tweak the script so that it focused on the father of the family rather than the son, moving Lampoon movies beyond frat house madness and presenting something of a maturing of the brand on the big screen. It didn't really maintain that path later on, but you know, such is life, I guess. Telling the story of Clark Griswold and his family's mishap-laden trip across America, from their family home in Illinois to the Wally World Park in California, Vacation was a platform to both satirize the middle class and allow its star to deliver what would become his most iconic performance. Whatever you think of Chevy Chase, and a lot of people seem to hate working with him, he's undeniably brilliant here. It was also the film which demonstrated that he could headline and carry a movie as the leading man. He went from a famous comedy actor to one of Hollywood's most in-demand names. Vacation was a regular family favourite of the Culture Slice household when I was a kid, and although the film has clearly aged after more than 40 years, it was a lot of fun to revisit it for this video. The supporting cast, led by Beverly D'Angelo, Dana Barron, and a pre-16 Candles Anthony Michael Hall, as Clark's long-suffering family, are uniformly good in backing up Chase. Randy Quaid's cameo as Cousin Eddie is a highlight, and John Candy even turns up towards the end as a Wally World security guard. Holiday Road by Lindsey Buckingham is undoubtedly one of the best theme songs of any 80s movie, and the potential for future films with the Griswolds was clear. Vacation was also received pretty well by critics, with the New York Times review noting that it was more controlled than other Lampoon movies have been, and even Gene Siskel, who tends to not like the kind of movies I'm interested in covering, praised the Lampoon's latest cinematic effort.
Now, this film is a no-brainer to be sure, but the writers have come up with enough jokes like that one that ring true, and enough jokes that are so ridiculous, including one very sick joke about one of their maiden aunts who takes the trip on top of their car. Well, I think the whole thing works. And Chevy Chase has finally found a picture in which he can lean back and not force himself upon us. That's because the writing is so good. I like taking this vacation.
Released by Warner Brothers in July of 1983, Vacation took the Lampoon name back to the top of the North American box office. Staying at number 1 for 3 weeks, it ended up grossing more than $61 million from that initial run. It was the 10th highest grossing film of 1983. After some low years, National Lampoon was back in the spotlight. Despite drawing less than Animal House in cinemas, Vacation was also able to have a considerably longer direct shelf life. The movie would become a massive hit on video, maintained a continued presence on TV for decades, and established a franchise that lived well beyond the first film. This was the blueprint for a successful future for Lampoon movies. Not just literally more vacations, but more film explorations of the American family, the American middle class, and society as a whole, reflecting and exaggerating the built-in audience. With Vacation, they had cracked the code, if anyone behind the scenes was able to notice and make note of it. Whether through design or circumstance, the company was back near the top of the film business. Studio Warner Brothers' subsequent demands for a sequel were inevitable. Arriving 2 years on from the first film, in July of 1985, National Lampoon's European Vacation maintained Chase and D'Angelo as the leads, but recast their family and saw a complete change of creative leads behind the cameras too. With John Hughes busy crafting a career as the 1980s ultimate teen movie filmmaker, the script for the European jaunt came from Robert Klein, who went on to write Weekend at Bernie's and, yes, Weekend at Bernie's 2, Electric Boogaloo. Ramis too was no longer around, replaced as director for the sequel by Amy Heckerling, who had made Fast Times at Ridgemont High and would later write and direct both Look Who's Talking and Clueless. Heckerling was a pretty solid replacement. transplanting Clark, Ellen and their strangely different-looking Griswold children to the story of a stereotype-filled trip across Europe that they won on a pig-based game show. European Vacation made less than the original, clocking in just under $50 million domestically, but this was still enough to be considered a hit for the studio. I think it holds up well, has its moments for sure, and also maintains the awesome Holiday Road theme song. But the general critical consensus was that the movie was an inferior sequel, and that the series was running out of ideas at times. Running out of ideas was, funnily enough, something that seemed to be happening to the National Lampoon more generally. It's hopefully not a spoiler to say that things ended up alright for the Griswold family in the movies, but things were looking worryingly like it might not be the same for the media company who spawned them. The troubles of two films made before European Vacation signposted the direction of travel for the Lampoon going forward in Hollywood far more accurately than the Chevy Chase hit movies. Robert Altman, yes, Robert Altman, who had been nominated for 2 Best Director Oscars in the 1970s, attempted to return to Hollywood with a teen comedy called O.C. and Stiggs, based on characters from the Lampoon magazine. Sounds mad, but this really happened. After a fraught production in 1983, the film was shelved by Studio MGM and not released until 1987, nearly 4 years later. When it finally did make it to cinemas, O.C. and Stiggs carried no mention of the National Lampoon, made essentially nothing at the box office, and remains a slightly bizarre moment in Altman's career. The other movie, National Lampoon's Joy of Sex, was initially set to be made from a script by Hughes and featuring Belushi as its lead star, after Paramount Pictures had literally bought the rights to the book of the same name simply so they could use the title. The movie would feature a series of comedy sketches totally unrelated to the source material. In addition, the studio wanted Belushi in a diaper on the poster. Very little of this actually ended up happening. In the end, the final film had been made without any direct involvement of Lampoon-related talent, and Lampoon owner Matty Simmons brought legal action to attempt to have its name removed from the film's title. As Simmons stated at the time, "We simply don't like to take credit or responsibility for a picture that we have nothing to do with." If only future owners of the National Lampoon had taken a similar stance. Anyway, the film squirted onto cinema screens in August of '84 and failed to make back its $5 million budget. Director Martha Coolidge remembers that the whole experience was pretty miserable. The full movie is available on YouTube, and the experience of viewing it 40 years on isn't really any better. Despite having essentially nothing to do with the finished movie, this whole episode had already begun the dilution of the Lampoon brand, which would be accelerated over the following decade. Yeah. Before we get to all that though, Christmas, as it has a habit of doing, would soon arrive to paper over the cracks of a looming disaster. National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation reunited the brand with both writer John Hughes and star Chevy Chase. Based on another Hughes short story from the magazine, the reality is that this attempted relaunch was only happening because Warner Brothers wanted a sequel. The Lampoon's power had evaporated by the late 80s. Christmas Vacation told the story of Clark, Ellen, and even more different looking kids attempting to celebrate the season despite everything going wrong, and the arrival of a seemingly endless influx of family members, including Randy Quaid's cousin Eddie from the first movie. Original director Chris Columbus quit the project as he hated working with Chase, and Hughes claimed that he only agreed to do it as he had a ready-made story, and the studio came to me and begged for another one. Despite this, under new director Jeremiah Chechik, Christmas Vacation was the biggest hit of the series, making over $70 million at the box office, and perhaps more importantly, becoming a legitimate and deserved Christmas classic on video, DVD and TV for decades to come. But nothing in life lasts forever. Christmas Vacation would also prove the end of the peak of Chase's career. He starred in box office duds like Nothing But Trouble and Memoirs of an Invisible Man in the early 90s, before attempting to pivot to chat show host in one of the most notoriously misguided decisions in TV history. The Chevy Chase Show was truly awful and was cancelled after just 6 weeks in 1993. The thing is, National Lampoon's decline would, over time, be far steeper than Chase's. The messy, bizarre, chaotic fall of National Lampoon was about to begin, and it was going to make the Chevy Chase Show look half decent. Maybe.
What's the matter, Senor Luigi? You look a little nervous.
I'm very nervous.
If I knew you were going to be this enthusiastic, I would have rehearsed. Everybody ready? You're gonna really have to thicken that stuff up, because I had to shower within, I don't know, a minute and a half. You know,
Wait, cut the music. I know it didn't get great reviews at the time, but Loaded Weapon 1 being included in this montage? That isn't considered part of the fall of National Lampoon in Hollywood, is it? In fact, when I was younger, I thought it was really cool. I mean, it's no Hot Shots Part 2 or anything, but it was unquestionably a mid-sized hit. Also, I refuse to believe that the rest of this story is all about the fall of National Lampoon. That's more than 30 years of decline. Surely the story is more positive for at least part of the 90s. For anyone in the gallery, can we just double check this before we continue with the video? Hi Jim. Really? That bad? How many 0% scores on Rotten Tomatoes? There's a film called Endless Bummer? And there's a sequel to Christmas Vacation without Chevy Chase? Right, thanks. Okay, that makes sense now. Loaded Weapon 1 was unfortunately definitely part of the fall, even if it wasn't instantly obvious at the time. And yes, aside from one or two occasional flickers of hope, it really is all downhill from here. On with the video.
Game on!
Yeah, game on!
By the early 90s, the ownership of National Lampoon had changed hands twice in 2 years. Initially bought by a consortium which included Animal House star Tim Matheson, the second new owner, J2 Communications, claimed in late 1990 that they were purchasing a great franchise name in National Lampoon and were going to build on that. Led by Jim Jamiro, a former Disney exec who oversaw the launch of the Disney Channel in 1983, J2's plans would actually hasten the demise of the Lampoon brand in the long term. The magazine had gone to a bi-monthly publication in the mid-80s, so J2 attempted to restore it to monthly editions in 91 and make it once again the bedrock of the business, the creative hub from which the rest of the organisation would flow. But times had changed, and J2 would end up only publishing 9 copies in 1991. That dropped to just 1 in 1992, the contractually obligated amount required to keep using the Lampoon name. So they went for Plan B instead, leasing the company's name out to movies for a fee. It would be almost 3 years after J2's takeover before a new National Lampoon movie would hit cinemas, even though the Lampoon's creative involvement in its movies had declined across the 80s. Selling the name without any creative control would become its cinematic business model. Though this initially staved off bankruptcy, it was still, to put it mildly, a complete and utter disaster. Essentially, the company would now become purely a name for hire. Anyone with a bit of cash and an idea to make a comedy film could benefit from its rapidly declining influence. The unsustainable damage this would do might not have been abundantly clear at first, and it could be justified by desperate times calling for desperate measures, I guess. The makers and stars of their 80s movies had moved on, and the company weren't cultivating replacements. It was now time to sell its soul for whatever money it could get. With this shift in focus taking place behind the scenes, Loaded Weapon 1 arrived in cinemas in early 1993 as the first film of a brand new era. Directed and co-written by Gene Quintano, who had scripted both Police Academy 3 and 4, the premise for Loaded Weapon did share some elements of satirical comedy with the Lampoon brand, but was an attempt to connect to the parody world of Airplane and the Naked Gun, as opposed to dissecting American society as the Vacation films had done. Starring Emilio Estevez and Samuel L. Jackson, Loaded Weapon 1 took the mickey out of the Lethal Weapon films in particular, but also a scattergun mixture of other late 80s and early 90s movies. Parody films weren't exactly cutting edge, but for the teenage me, the National Lampoon link was still something of a stamp of quality. I watched Loaded Weapon again for this video, and it still made me laugh. A lot. So I was surprised to see how negative the reviews were at the time.
Loaded Weapon 1 seems like a quickie, slapdash production.
I had the same reaction. I didn't laugh that much.
No.
And in a movie like this, it's really criticism proof. You either report that you laughed or you report that you didn't laugh. And my report is I didn't laugh.
Variety called it more an imitation than a parody, and very short on laughs, and Time Out's review stated that this Loaded Weapon fires only dum-dum bullets, but it did make money in cinemas and performed well on video too. But after managing some of the biggest comedy hits of the previous 15 years, by the mid-90s the Lampoon's hit rate soon went from patchy to non-existent, as a whole host of new comedy faces became hit makers and major Hollywood players. The company was well and truly left behind. Attack of the 5'2" Women arrived in 1994 on Showtime, mocking recent American scandals like the Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding incident and the controversy of John and Lorena Bobbitt. Maybe don't Google that second one. That same year, the indefensibly bad Last Resort arrived on video and reunited Corey's Haim and Feldman as two losers who take over the management of a tropical holiday resort. This felt like rock bottom, but there were in fact further depths to plumb. This era was, to put it mildly, a directionless mess. But it wasn't all bad. I rewatched Favourite Deadly Sins, Dennis Leary's directorial debut, and I quite enjoyed it. It was never going to halt the decline of the brand, and was largely forgotten after its 1995 debut on Showtime, but this was at least a rare bright spot in the researching of this video, which was, at times, painful. For me, but apparently not for many others, another bright side came in the Lampoon's next release. And this one did make it to cinemas. National Lampoon's senior trip also arrived in 1995. I have a lasting memory of this being a personal favourite of teenage me when it would be shown late night on Sky Movies back in the day, so my nostalgic haze might cloud my judgment on this deep Lampoon cut. But there's no arguing that to most at the time it was considered a complete and utter dud. I don't agree, but it's sadly a fact of life. After the success it had seen producing Loaded Weapon, upstart studio New Line Cinema had decided to repeat the trick by slapping Senior Trip with the Lampoon branding for release in the US and other selected markets. Telling the story of a group of seniors at an Ohio high school who were invited to meet the president in Washington. The cast included former Max Headroom Matt Frewer, Chong, but not Cheech, and Jeremy Renner's first ever film role. It's absolutely of its time, but the fact that it has a 0% score on Rotten Tomatoes is, to me, unbelievably harsh. Either way, it made less than $5 million in cinemas, and as the first Lampoon branded movie to hit cinemas in almost 2 years, was viewed as a sign of how far the company had fallen in the new decade.
National Lampoon Senior Trip.
Let's party!
Even if I still get a kick out of these movies 30 years on from their debut, the general trajectory was still very much down in all metrics. A further, even more damning demonstration of this came in 1997 when Warner Brothers decided to release a brand new vacation movie starring Chevy Chase, but decided against licensing the National Lampoon name to attach to it. Even though the story for Vegas Vacation didn't come from the Lampoon magazine, it was still a bit of a kick in the for the company as a whole. It wasn't like Vegas Vacation was a wildly successful movie or anything. It cost $25 million to make, only grossed just over $36 million, got terrible reviews, and completely failed to relaunch Chase's career as a Hollywood movie headliner. But even if Vegas Vacation was a failure, the symbolism of the Lampoon's key film series voluntarily parting ways with its name was clear for everyone to see. Besides, at least it got to cinemas. As its most successful film series was moving on without it, the Lampoon produced a number of movies which didn't get near a theatre release in the 90s and continued the trend of the brand's reputation circling the plug hole. In 1998, the Lampoon name was attached to two more disasters. Men in White parodied Men in Black and Independence Day with a story of garbage men fighting aliens. Then the straight-to-video Golf Punks arrived that year as well, starring Tom Arnold, attempting to piggyback off the success of Happy Gilmore and falling flat on its face. The Lampoon Company struggled increasingly for both relevance and cash flow in the following years. The magazine had ceased publishing in 1998, attempts to tap into the dot-com boom and launch a website featuring new content didn't prove successful, and there wouldn't even be a Lampoon movie in cinemas for years. But in 2002, a sliver of hope appeared on the horizon. A low-budget college comedy had been tested with audiences under just its title and then with the words National Lampoon added before its title as well. The reaction was noticeably more positive with the Lampoon connection. It probably would have been a hit anyway, but the connection to the brand's history did seem to still add value.
The National Lampoon tradition continues.
So in the spring of 2002, National Lampoon's Van Wilder arrived in cinemas. Director Walt Becker had never made a movie before, but Van Wilder still had a fair amount going for it. Newcomer Ryan Reynolds was graduating from a successful sitcom to take the title role. The cast also included Tara Reid, still riding high from the American Pie films. Animal House star and one-time Lampoon owner Tim Matheson even played Van Wilder's dad. It felt like the kind of generational crossroads film the Lampoon could only dream of had landed in its lap. Critics hated it, with the New York Times review calling it the sort of low-grade dreck that usually goes straight to video, with a lousy script, inept direction, pathetic acting, poorly dubbed dialogue, and murky cinematography. And the Miami Herald called it an utter waste of time with next to nothing to do with the infinitely wittier Golden Age National Lampoon movies. Audiences didn't care though, and they made Van Wilder a hit. On a $5 million budget, the film made $38 million in cinemas, but it really found its home on video and DVD, where it's sold by the bucket load. It's crass in places, sure, and it's very much of its time as well, but at that time it made perfect sense. These were my peak party days, and Van Wilder tapped into that at just the right moment. The soundtrack CD is somewhere in the house if I look hard enough. I didn't get the awful reviews at the time, it was never going to be a darling, but it was better than a lot of the late 90s and early 2000s college comedies that saw the light of day. And more on some of those later. Either way, Van Wilder was a critic-proof film. National Lampoon was relevant for the first time in years. Even if it wasn't creating trends anymore, filthy teen comedies were everywhere again by the early 2000s, and Van Wilder was part of the zeitgeist. The fact that Party Liaison became a sleeper hit would, in the long term, only hurt Lampoon more though. At the time, it was some sort of affirmation that licensing out the name worked, and it led to a doubling down on this strategy by the new owners of the company. You see, Lampoon Inc. had changed hands once again. This time, a group of Indianapolis-based investors, led by Daniel Lakin, took the majority control of the company. Lakin would eventually bring notoriety back to National Lampoon for all the wrong reasons, but for now his plan was to follow the Van Wilder licensing blueprint. The only problem was, Van Wilder was a one-off, a false dawn, lightning in a bottle. It was headlined by an actor on the cusp of movie stardom, the supporting cast was legitimately good, and the film built enough momentum to ride the wave of the new frat party movie boom. There were no guarantees that this would ever happen again if the Lampoon had control over the movies it was producing, but given that they were selling their name to any Tom or Harry, or randomly buying the rights to cheap already made comedies in a vain attempt to make a quick buck on DVD, then the odds of returning to former glories were at best a very unlikely roll of the dice. And oh boy, did the next few years demonstrate just how difficult a moment in time Van Wilder would be to repeat. The National Lampoon movies which did make it to cinemas could not replicate its success. Even a sequel to Van Wilder, 2006's The Rise of Taj, couldn't do the job. Making just $6 million in cinemas, Variety noted that Van Wilder 2 might stay in the honour of the Lampoon label if it hadn't already produced several even worse films. Movies like Blackball, a British comedy about a bad boy bowls player which had been released in 2003, was flung out in the US 2 years later with National Lampoon slapped over the top to be quickly forgotten. In the wake of Van Wilder, the company's strategy of doubling down on the sell the name off and stack the DVDs high approach was doing nothing for National Lampoon. It was somewhat ironic then that, when it came to the release of a third actual Van Wilder film, 2009's straight-to-DVD freshman year, starring Jonathan Bennett instead of Ryan Reynolds, Studio Paramount released it without feeling the need to bother with the Lampoon name. Even if Van Wilder eventually flew the nest though, the 2000s did see some absolute stinkers released with the National Lampoon name attached to them. Films which were invariably made by a random production company without any connection to the brand, and what had been a trickle soon became a huge wave of rubbish movies. Actually, hang on. That gives me an idea. It's top 10 time. So with the floodgates now well and truly open, what exactly flowed out with the brand's name attached? Well, today we're gonna count them down. The dirgiest of the dirge, the laziest of the lazy. That's right, it's time for the Culture Slice approved chart of the bottom 10 lowlights. The worst National Lampoon movies of the 2000s and beyond. And yes, disclaimer, these are all real films. Number 10. In the 2000s, the Lampoon Company had the idea of adding presents rather than lampoons before the titles of films they were less than proud of, in an attempt to create some level of distance from the responsibility for the worst of the movies which carried their name. And the first film to be labelled with this branding was Dorm Days, which somehow managed to make it to cinemas for a limited release in 2003. Featuring Tatiana Ali, Daniel Fishel, Topanga from Boy Meets World, and the Shermanator himself, Chris Owen, Dorm Days was a charmless, filthy college comedy of errors. But the Lampoon must have been proud of its performance as, 3 years later, they reverted back to National Lampoons for its sequel. And that sequel is the film which makes it to number 10 on our list. Yes, it's Dorm Days 2, College at Sea. Transplanting the good times of the first movie to a college semester on a cruise ship, Dorm Days 2 manages to sink this already poor series to new lows with a mirthless 100-minute chore featuring increasingly random and desperate attempts at humour. Going for the vibe of a filthier American Pie on the water, Dorm Days 2 ends up as more of an old kebab left by the bins after a Saturday night out. There was actually supposed to be a third Dorm Days film, but that ended up being released as something called Transylmania, a 2009 effort in which students spend a semester in Transylvania. Transylmania isn't exactly a banger, but it does get small points for bothering to shoot the movie in Romania. Dorm Days 2 made almost $1 million in DVD rentals in its first week on release though, so you know, who's laughing now? Not anybody who saw this movie. Number 9. Number 9 pains me. I really wanted this one to work. The parody concept was lazy, but it still had the potential for a few cheap laughs. In at number 9, it's The Legend of Awesomeness Maximus, a National Lampoon Does 300 romp, released in some quarters as 301. 301? Get it? Anyway. Will Sasso stars as Awesomest. The movie was made by Jeff Canoe, who directed Revenge of the Nerds in the 80s, and the cast is a pick and mix of recognisable TV and film faces, but the material is as stupid as you can get, and not in a good way. Originally set for a cinema release, Awesomeness Maximus instead went straight to DVD. I would say that this terrible film was a letdown, but considering Canu also directed National Lampoon's Adam and Eve a couple of years earlier, that shouldn't have been a surprise. Next. Number 8. Number 8 really should be a bit better too. It's made by Neil Israel, who directed Bachelor Party and wrote the first Police Academy movie, and stars Judge Reinhold and a pre-Breaking Bad Bryan Cranston, and is a sort of vacation homage without any of the charm. National Lampoon's Holiday Reunion is certainly no vacation for anyone, especially the viewer. Licking body parts and farting are the height of the wit demonstrated in this TV movie gone very wrong. Walter White deserved better. Number 7. Speaking of vacation, a legitimate sequel to Christmas Vacation comes crashing in at number 7. Christmas Vacation 2, Cousin Eddie's Island Adventure, was made for NBC in 2003 and brings back Randy Quaid from the original film as his family gets shipwrecked on a South Pacific island. Quaid's character worked in the original films, but as the lead here, he is completely out of his depth. And that's not even considering the tragically unfunny script. However bad you've heard this movie is, when you watch it, you're likely to think that the reviews have been too kind. Number 6. Number 6 is a real collector's item. Did you know that Paris Hilton starred in a National Lampoon sorority comedy? Well, here it is, in all its glory. National Lampoon's Pledge This starts with a toilet exploding and doesn't get much better from there. This was a strange time in the Lampoon's history, an era where their name-adorned, cheaply made movies starring an increasingly random selection of recognizable faces. The same year Pledge This was released, John Bon Jovi starred as a lawyer financing a ladies' ice hockey team in Pucked. Yes, Pucked, not and Primus's Les Claypool made a Spinal Tap style mockumentary called Electric Apricot Quest for Festeroo. Neither are peak Lampoon, but they're both not as bad as Paris Hilton's effort. Released in 2006, Pledge This tells the story of Hilton's snobby sorority at Florida's South Beach University, as they are joined by a group of unconventional pledges. And hilarity does not ensue. I guess the flipping of the narrative to concentrate more on a female college experience is progress of some kind, but there's no denying that Pledge This fails as a movie on essentially every level. This could easily have charted in the top 3, but I have to admit that it did maintain a strange sense of intrigue as a time capsule of the very strange pop culture era of the mid-2000s. Number 5. Crashing in at number 5 is Ratko, the Dictator's Son, the story of an Eastern European tyrant's son who goes to college in the US. A film so bad that even Batman Adam West's appearance as said dictator cannot save it. A post-Napoleon Dynamite Ephraim Ramirez plays the title character. It's directed by Steve Holland, who made Better Off Dead and One Crazy Summer in the 80s. It looks incredibly cheap, and the jokes are even cheaper. In 2007, the Lampoon announced that it would be returning to producing its own films for the first time in almost 2 decades. At that point, then Lampoon boss Daniel Lakin stated that the only way to take control of the brand was to make sure that ultimately we put it on projects that we are proud of. One of the first new Lampoon films to go into production was Ratko. Quite the statement of intent. I read a review that called it the B-movie Borat, and I think that might be doing it too much justice. Number 4. Number 4 on our chart is 2008's worryingly titled National Lampoon Presents Cattle Call, a movie in which 3 dudes create a fake casting opportunity to try to score chicks. I mean, the poster is enough to raise alarm bells, and as the plot escalates, things just get more and more disturbing. Not only does it come across as some sort of poorly made high school student film, but it's incredibly unlikable to go with it. I can abide by a lot in a lowbrow comedy, but above all it needs to be funny, and Cattle Call is not. Very not. The best thing about researching Cattle Call was finding out that Thomas Ian Nicholas released a cover of Bowling for Soup's 1989 called 1999, with all the lyrics being references to the American Pie films. He released this in 2022. Although it's totally random, it's actually pretty great. Moving on. Number 3. Top 3 time now, and the bronze medal goes to National Lampoon's Dirty Movie, a film in which a producer attempts to make a movie featuring the filthiest jokes ever told. There is a bizarre meta thing going on here, as this one is about the production of an awful film within an awful film. And there's also a sequel to this called Another Dirty Movie, so someone must have watched it. But I genuinely struggled to finish this one. It's so poorly made and dull that it feels like a parody of a terrible Lampoon movie. But this is real, sadly, although they are making a film within a film, so is it actually real? Where am I? Why is Cyndi Lauper in this movie? What is love, Hadaway? Medic? I think this has actually made me lose my mind. Number 2. Number 2 on the charts, but not number 2 in our hearts. National Lampoon's TV the Movie is quite possibly the maddest film I have ever seen. The concept is supposed to be a clever dissection of television in the 2000s and its impact on society, but the reality is a truly awful mixture of skits parodying shows and adverts. The cast list is also wild, with half of Jackass and Jay, without Silent Bob, and Judd Nelson, and the $6 Million Man Lee Majors. This heady mix of ingredients could potentially have churned out something, but the film we did get is essentially unwatchable. A fever dream of madness that leaves you questioning the meaning of existence itself. But probably not in the way the makers intended. Number 1. And at number 1, the worst of the worst in the eyes of Culture Slice. Drumroll please. It's National Lampoon's Gold Diggers. Not to be confused with 1995's Gold Diggers, The Secret of Bear Mountain, a very different family film starring Christina Ricci. The National Lampoon version stars Will Friedle, Eric from Boy Meets World, and Chris Owen, yes, him again, as a pair of stupid blokes who marry 2 wealthy women so they can inherit their fortunes. However, plot twist, these older sisters in turn want to use the guys for a life insurance payout scam. Gold Diggers is poorly made, nasty of spirit, there is nobody you even come close to rooting for, and in the worst crime of all, it is painfully unfunny. It has been referred to as one of the worst movies ever made, and I would say that isn't too far off the mark. For me, Gold Diggers encapsulates all that is wrong with so many of the late National Lampoon branded releases. For a rowdy, filthy comedy to work, it needs to both be funny on occasion and have its heart in the right place when you strip back all the chaos. Gold Diggers never comes close to having either. Any of your least favourites which didn't make the list? Any clear and present dangers I've left off? Or have I been too harsh? I mean, there's enough films to make an entirely different and justifiable top 10. Let me know in the comments, but health and safety warning, do not try this at home. I need to lie down. So for posterity and fairness, while I have a moment of zen, here's my list of the best ever Lampoon films. Before too long, the dubious quality of their films, or the cancellation of TV formats like the short-lived comedy quiz show Funny Money, would be the least of the Lampoon's concerns. As the 2000s rolled on, the major economic downturn of 2008 loomed large, and the company, which had already been losing money every year since the late 90s and was struggling to maintain relevance, saw its already shaky situation worsen. In December of the same year, chief executive and financial backer Daniel Lakin was arrested by the FBI at his home and charged with fraud for attempting to illegally inflate the company's stock price. Yes, National Lampoon was indeed on the stock market. 2 years later, Lakin was found guilty and sentenced to 45 months in prison. If that wasn't bad enough for the Lampoon, the void left by Lakin's sudden disappearance was filled by a new CEO, fellow investor Tim Durham. After an era in which there had been far too many Lampoon licensed films being released, Durham would essentially stop active film development and prioritise suing Warner Brothers, claiming that the company was due more royalties for Vacation in the 80s. A move which did help to stave off bankruptcy when Warner's agreed to pay out. Durham's reign too would soon end at the hands of the FBI when he was arrested in early 2011 and charged with conducting a Ponzi scheme which defrauded more than 5,000 investors out of over $200 million. By 2012, he had been sentenced to 50 years in jail. It probably goes without saying that, with its two most recent bosses having been put in prison, the National Lampoon was not in a great state. Aside from a leadership vacuum, a non-existent film division, and the fact that they hadn't really had any success in years, the company was now embroiled in a wider web of businesses through which Durham had committed his crimes. And numerous lawsuits would drag on for years as a new CEO, comedian, actor and writer of both dirty movies, Alan Duns, attempted to somehow rebuild the brand's image and secure deals with major media companies. Could the Lampoon become a film industry underdog story of triumph in the face of adversity and come back from the depths of despair after decades of misuse? Sadly, no. For all intents and purposes, National Lampoon's time as a going concern seems to have ended in the wake of all this chaos. In 2015, Vacation got a reboot starring Ed Helms and Christina Applegate, which made over $100 million at the box office, but got fairly savaged by critics and audiences and hasn't led to a slew, or in fact any sequels. Even if everyone knew what it was based on, the words National Lampoon were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps not surprising, given what that label has come to represent. A film financing company called Palm Star Media bought the brand for $12 million in 2017, but no actual Lampoon films have been financed since then. They hired a new CEO, Evan Shapiro, in 2019, with the objective of bringing the brand back to life. They relaunched the Lampoon Radio Hour as a podcast later that year, but by 2020, Shapiro had been fired and slapped with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against him, claiming that he had funneled money from Lampoon deals to his own separate non-Lampoon organisations. I mean, this company. After Shapiro's exit, there don't seem to have been any new podcast episodes since 2020. Nowadays, their social channels haven't posted anything in years, and the company's website just has an email sign-up page with clips of Animal House playing in the background. I signed my email address up, but haven't received anything yet. But now, if this really is the end, with the company seemingly no longer producing anything, and the chances of a new film or two feeling less likely than the odds of me sitting down to watch Gold Diggers anytime soon, what lasting impact can be drawn from surveying the wild, unique journey of the National Lampoon in Hollywood? Cut the music.
Cut the music.
Thanks, Rick. I just feel like that music is a bit too cheery as, more than anything, the plight of National Lampoon is a bit sad. I mean, as former Lampoon writer PJ O'Rourke put it before the worst of what the company would become in the 2000s, what National Lampoon turned into breaks my heart, to tell you the truth. Can we have something a tad more reflective, please? That'll do. Anyway, When it came to building a long-term cinematic success story, the leaders of the National Lampoon proved themselves to be somewhat out of their depth over the decades. One-off hits like Animal House, Vacation and Van Wilder were driven by the talents involved in those movies, and when they went off to make different films, National Lampoon had nowhere to go. Really, the structure from the very start meant that sustaining long-term prominence on the big screen would be done via luck more than planning. A slow, painful decline was probably always inevitable, and it's been slow, and oh boy has it been painful. In terms of its legacy, perhaps the National Lampoon just did its job. It helped to usher in a new era for comedy, both in print and on screen, and a new representation for younger people in media more generally as well. It showed that a different type of movie could dominate the box office, and many would argue it had far wider reaching influence. Whether you agree with the concept or not, if there are legitimate debates on news channels about whether a film was a turning point for America in general 45 years after its release, then its legacy has to be considered assured. Though it didn't invent the teen comedy or the college movie, Animal House breathed an entirely new, less sanitized life into the format and turned the slobs versus snobs comedy into one of Hollywood's go-to stories. If you've ever seen an American Pie movie, or Old School, or basically any movie with a college party scene, then that film owes something of a debt of gratitude to Animal House. They struggled to follow up that success immediately, but the Vacation movies offered a glimpse of the slightly more grown-up road the company could have taken forward. Sadly, that didn't end up happening. And I get it, the monoculture of everyone consuming the same media is long gone, comedy films rarely make it to cinemas anymore, and the Lampoon soon lost its best talent. I'm not expecting National Lampoon to be at the forefront of the entertainment industry in 2025. But the brand was burned out before the end of the 80s. Surely, with just a little more forward planning, it could have had a slightly longer run in the sun. I mean, Saturday Night Live is still going to this day. National Lampoon lacked the structure, vision and leadership to survive effectively in Hollywood. Without the creative leads and connection to the magazine, before long, its films became little more than random movies with a rented name at the beginning. Only, as that name became less and less relevant, the movies which it adorned became worse and worse too. I found this making of doc for Gold Diggers whilst researching for this video, and writer-director Gary Presler was discussing how his film carried on the lineage of Animal House and Vacation, creating a great, memorable, character-driven comedy and what he described as an interesting, fairly intelligent story, not just dumb comedy. Gold Diggers doesn't have the qualities Presler said it would, but he's right in some senses. That's what a National Lampoon release should have been. Hitting screens in 2003, Gold Diggers remains the only film Presler has directed more than 20 years later, and with proper management in place, the Lampoon name would have never been anywhere near it. The brand should have been managed as a gold standard for comedy by its owners, a platform that talent builds towards appearing in. Instead, it was the complete opposite, a messy free-for-all without oversight, which delivered often embarrassing results. The stars of the original Vacation film reunite periodically for various nostalgic media moments, but the Lampoon brand is nowhere to be seen when that happens either.
Another dud.
Hey, I'll check the turkey.
Maybe it doesn't have to be seen as such a sad story, depending on your perspective. Perhaps it's better to say that there were actually only a handful of real National Lampoon films. Films which were inspired by the magazine and created by those who had a connection to the company, and the rest of the interlopers that followed were just a conveyor belt of poor attempts to live up to that brand's past glories. Whatever number of National Lampoon movies you consider to be the correct one, in the end, it became a burnt-out sports car of a company. The influence and impact it achieved, even briefly, was still visible, but the Lampoon itself wasn't invited to the party it had helped to create. Rather than being treated like its own mini studio, the Lampoon's Hollywood business rapidly became an opportunity for the vultures to pick any meat that was left on the bones. Though its legacy does remain intact in some form, National Lampoon in Hollywood will also always feel like something of a missed opportunity, achieving a bright sparkle which very soon faded away. Oh great, you're still here. I wanted to say thank you for all the support Culture Slice has received over its first year in existence. We started from essentially zero 12 months ago and couldn't have imagined achieving these kinds of numbers already. As we start on the long road towards 4,000 subscribers, it is hugely appreciated, and yes, there is plenty more to come from the channel over the next year and beyond, so please do subscribe if you like this kind of thing. Coming up next on the Culture Slice slate will be the 5th episode of Sequel Palooza, and Lost Blockbusters will be making a return to the channel this year too. Plus there are some brand new video concepts in the oven as well, although they will of course still be very much rooted in the glorious time for pop culture that was the 1980s and 90s. Are there any clues about what the next Sequel Palooza episode might be covering? Who knows?
It's not true.
Is that true?
No, it's not true.
Ha-ha! So it is true.
A double negative.
If you want to keep up with the latest from Culture Slice, then you can also follow the channel on Instagram, where my New Year's resolution is to actually post something. In the meantime, thanks again for choosing to spend some time with Culture Slice. Here's to a great 2025 for us all, and of course, save Ferris.